There are many purposes to which aircraft can be put. For some of these, it's desirable that the aeroplane be as big as is practical to build and to use. At the moment, this is one of the biggest planes in the world, the Antonov 124, the Soviet equivalent of Lockheed's giant C-5. Capable of a takeoff weight of nearly 900,000 pounds, the AN-124 is a modern giant. Of course, the largest aircraft ever constructed dwarf a plane like the Antonov. They were lighter than air and capable of prodigious lifting. The German pioneer of rigid airships, Graf Ferdinand von Zeppelin, whose name is synonymous with them, had started his developments in 1900, and it was the success of his company's advances of the concept that encouraged some competitive experimentation and research around the world over the next 30 years. The United States Navy became one of the major players in the International Airship Big League, with the building of the Shenandoah and subsequently the Akron and Macon. The US Navy's airships established a good record in operations, combining well with fleet activity, although their jettisoning of water ballast like this may not have always won every sailor's affection. The picture of airships stored in the collective memory is of them spread over hillsides, helpless in the face of extreme weather and fatally uncontrollable. This is the famous wreck of the Shenandoah, more confirmation of the airship's bad reputation. But what's overlooked is that that ship had successfully flown for 2 trouble-free years prior to the mistaken route decision, taken against the advice of her captain, that had doomed her. There are those who still expound the case for rigid airships, and they have several very good arguments to support their assertions. Modern airships should be very efficient, cheap to operate, and theoretically at least, very safe. That there were successful airships and proportionately very little loss of life in the crashes seems today to count for little. But the return of the airship cannot be discounted as a possibility for the future. For the moment, the largest aircraft ever flown will remain the giant Zeppelins of the 30s, culminating in the Hindenburg, 804 feet long. Against the record of the airships, aeroplanes were making little headway. Limitations on size and range were exacerbated by the available engines' lack of power and reliability and the scarcity of adequate landing fields. However, in the years leading up to World War II, the development of air travel began to pick up speed, and the 30s were marked by a succession of airliners, getting more sophisticated and bigger, with increases in both range and capacity. While the period between the wars saw a gradual emergence of practical land-based passenger aircraft, more prominent, for a number of reasons, were the flying boats. The seas, lakes and rivers of the planet offered a ready supply of maintenance-free air bases at a time when few land-based aerodromes had been constructed. The limited power of the engines of the day also meant that to have a significant capacity, a plane needed a number of engines and a long takeoff. So the era saw a succession of planes that quickly became quite large and then proceeded to get bigger. The British company Shorts was one of the leaders, along with most of the major American companies. Indeed, internationally, almost all the major aviation companies built flying boats, with varying success. The Boeing Clipper, seen here under construction, was one of the most successful of them and opened up the transatlantic route to American operators. We've mentioned earlier that the limited power of the engines of the day was a factor in the success of the flying boats. But another aspect of the engine's performance that came into play was their unreliability. If one was going to cross a very large expanse of water in a plane that could not rely on its engines to simply keep going, then it was obviously best if your plane had the ability to land safely on water. This extremely practical manifestation of the instinct for self-preservation meant that the flying boats were regarded with some affection and trust, while their land-based brethren were still widely considered unsafe. The German Dornier Company had also attempted to become engaged in the transatlantic passenger business with giant flying boats, and the Luftwaffe was to toy with such craft right through World War II. But it was the US Navy which employed the largest collection of types and extended their use. The Navy's patrol planes were formidably effective submarine hunters, as well as performing myriad other roles. The Martin Company's series of great flying boats for the Navy were outstanding in their success. The PBM Mariners served with wartime distinction in a great range of variants, from unarmed transports through to highly effective and heavily armed radar-carrying sub-killers. Because of their effectiveness and relative cheapness, the Mariners pushed back the priority of their bigger brother, the enormous four-engined Mars, and only a handful of these massive planes were constructed. With range approaching 5,000 miles, the 144,000-pound Mars, with 2 decks and a crew of 11, was so big that it inspired publicity men to arrange formal ceremonies at the launching on November the 5th, 1941. Embarrassingly, an accidental fire in one of the engines intervened to ruin the publicity value of that occasion. In the event, the plane's size worked against it. It simply was too daunting a prospect to arm it and upgrade it to military use. And against the cost of the developed Mariners, the Mars could not be justified. The few that were constructed were all made to transport specifications. The Mariners stayed with the Navy after the World War and through Korea, and the Martin Company continued to build flying boats, developments of the Mariner, for the Navy until 1960. But after the war, the availability of numerous concrete runways and thousands of planes to use them spelt the end of the flying boats era, especially as civil aircraft. Martin, with a history stretching back to include America's first indigenous bomber and a distinguished stable of other aircraft, no longer build planes, having focused entirely on missile production. It remains to speak of only one more of the wartime giant flying boats, the biggest of them all, Howard Hughes Hercules, popularly more familiar as the Spruce Goose. The 8-engined Hercules had a wingspan that remains the greatest ever built, 320 feet 6 inches, as compared to a Boeing 747's 195 feet. But the Boeing is not smaller. It weighs in at 320 tons, as compared to the Hercules' 190 tons. The smaller wing represents the march of technology. The Jumbo doesn't need the huge span of the Hercules. The Goose flew only once, just over a mile and only to a height of 70 feet in 1947. By that time, there was simply no need, nor any justification, for the Leviathan flying boat. The development of large land-based aircraft had eventually been made possible by the demands of the world's air forces for bombers. World War I had closed with the bombers of the day being very limited in terms of their speed, range, and ability to carry a worthwhile payload. Bigger bombers had been under development by all of the major combatants at war's end, and this work proceeded throughout the peace that followed. In 1923, the US first flew its new Barling bomber, which had been produced at great expense as a model for long-range heavy bombers of the future. In this, the Barling was to prove a disappointment, being one of the most unsuccessful designs of all time. Its designer, Walter Barling, had been responsible for the even more disastrous Tarrant Tabor, which was unable to fly, as the use of the engines insanely placed between the upper wings simply threw it onto its nose at takeoff. The Barling was protected from this by the otherwise useless undercarriage bolted to the front of the plane, but the designer seemed to have learnt little else from his earlier experience. 3 wings, 4 rudders, 6 engines and 10 landing wheels, together with a multitude of struts, braces and wires, gave the Barling sufficient drag to ensure that, though it did fly, it did so pretty reluctantly, and, cruising at 60 miles per hour, if saddled with any sort of payload, it was limited to under 200 miles total range. Despite its military uselessness, the Barling was a very big plane, and for some time was a sort of success as a public relations exercise, and flew wallowingly around the US making special appearances. Eventually it became too embarrassing and was scrapped. Scrapping the Barling did not mean that the idea of big bombers had been abandoned. After a pause to let its memory die, large experimental planes were built that did test the ability of both the designers and the technology available to them. One of the most significant of these experiments was also a relative failure in that only one example was built. The program commenced in 1935, and the result, the Douglas XB-19, could be described as the first modern giant. Not until the B-36 came into service well after the war was the US to have a bigger bomber. The XB-19 encapsulates the twin design demands of the strategic bomber very neatly. It was built to carry a large load a very long way. In the case of the Douglas giant, the range was to be 7,000 miles, and the intent was to be able to bomb targets in Europe from bases in the United States. A very ambitious project. The XB-19 did not actually fly until 1941, and the company, by then, had lost enthusiasm for the project. In practical terms, the plane was simply an experiment, and there was no likelihood that there would be a production run of it. By then, there was enough new knowledge, some of it stemming from the experience of constructing the XB-19 itself, to make the plane superseded. Still, a crowd of awed servicemen would gather round it wherever it sat. A few months before the commencement of the XB-19 project, the Boeing company had been given a contract that was to produce a much smaller plane that would be far more influential in the coming conflict, the XB-15. Boeing's experience with that plane translated into the successful Flying Fortress, and Boeing have, of course, been building big aircraft ever since. One of the most significant of Boeing's bombers was the B-29 Superfortress, the plane that was to be World War II's most remarkable proof of the bomber's power. It's sobering to consider that during the course of the whole war, the Japanese armed forces suffered a total of 760,000 casualties, while in only 9 months of Superfortress action against Japan, over 806,000 civilian casualties were inflicted. Statistics like those forcefully ram home the strength of the case made by the proponents of large-scale bombing, and make sense of the efforts made to ensure the practicality of future deployment of bombers in the period since the war. The B-29 was not, in today's terms, a giant, but the plane that followed it into use as the Strategic Air Command's strike weapon, the B-36, certainly was. However, it was during the career of this plane that the nature of the bomber itself changed, and size was no longer such a virtue. The proportions and weight of the atomic bombs changed. The nature and effectiveness of anti-aircraft defences changed, and the power and reliability of jet technology was, over a few developmental generations, to radically improve. These factors contributed to a revision of the aircraft's expected role, speed and capability, and the radical advances made in the understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft design to transonic capability was to ensure that the future bomber would be a smaller package. There are, of course, several ways to consider a plane's size, from its overall wingspan and length to its weight or its capacity. The B-36 was certainly a giant in terms of its wingspan, and one of the biggest bombers ever to go into full-scale production. A plane with smaller dimensions replaced the B-36, Boeing's B-52 Stratofortress. But it could carry a greater load far further than the six-engined giant, at a speed about 50% faster. The remarkable B-52 came into service in 1954, commencing a career that would go on for over 30 years. While it's smaller than the B-36 in many respects, it's possibly truer to say that bombers ceased to get bigger rather than to infer that they have become small. No one in their right mind would assert that the B-52 is not a very big plane, as was the six-engined Mach 3 XB-70 Valkyrie that first flew in 1963, an engineering and design success that was abandoned for reasons that included the preference for nuclear-armed missiles and the presence of highly accurate radar-controlled air defences. The idea of the Valkyrie was rejected, as was the idea of the B-1 at first. Today's bomber is speedy, hugs the Earth with the assistance of computers, and employs stealth and suppression technologies. It can attempt a mission only because of its complex defensive avionics. Its job has become very tough. Some would argue impossible. At the end of the Second World War, it appeared that everything had changed in civil aviation. Engines could be relied on. There were thousands of multi-engined planes and a huge reserve of trained pilots. And the globe was now liberally spattered with concrete runways, even if many of them were in pretty obscure places. The era of air travel seemed to be about to seriously dawn. The manufacturers had enormous plants, teeming with trained employees experienced in designing and building large transports and bombers. They were obviously going to be able to supply the planes for this travel explosion, and indeed needed to do so to remain economically afloat. The first large post-war passenger planes followed the earlier pattern in being civil variants of military aircraft, such as Boeing's Stratocruiser, which, more than any other airliner, was the type which set the standard for long-range operations in its day. Only 55 were built, with a new two-deck pressurized fuselage married to the wings, engines, landing gear and other components of the B-29 Superfortress. Reportedly, their most popular feature was the lower deck lounge and cocktail bar. As bombers changed and became less compatible, the civil market hotted up, and with the availability of the new generations of jets delivering greater power, a revolution occurred. The civil market started again to require its own concepts. The most important process over this period was to lower the cost to the passenger, to encourage mass use of the aeroplane. But the market grew almost painfully slowly, and the size of passenger planes grew only gradually. The already overpowerful engines on the planes could, by this time, have been further increased in power enormously. But there was not firm enough foreseeable demand to make the enormous cost of development of significantly larger planes a secure investment. Instead, the companies developed a variety of planes with varying routes in mind, setting parameters on range and accommodation, up to, say, the long-range Boeing 707, capable of around 4,000 miles and seating up to 220 people. There were planes to cope with smaller needs than that, but there was no plane capable of carrying over double that number of passengers. Finally, the Boeing company took the move that really changed the world of civil aviation in bringing out its 747. The challenge was enormous. The plane in question had to be safe to operate from the world's existing runways and through the world's airport terminals. It had to inspire confidence in the public and be cheap enough to operate to allow charging that would truly broaden the market. It had to convince the airline operators and the civil aviation controllers, and then stand a chance of reaping a huge reward if the public response was as foreseen. First, the company had to design and construct the giant aircraft. The 747 made its maiden flight on February the 9th, 1969, and the first 747 entered service with Pan Am on January the 22nd, 1970. By then, the success of the project was assured, with firm orders for over 180 of the planes having been placed by the end of '69. Key to the plane was its employment of 4 huge gas turbine engines, which were the largest factor in producing a completely new low cost in air transport, principally by fuel savings. There are possible ways of increasing the flow of civil aviation. One is to make the planes faster or make them bigger, or a combination of both. For the moment, the 747, 20 years on, is still the basic factor in today's civil air transport scene. And with takeoff weights of up to 870,000 pounds, almost twice that of the B-1 bomber, is a very big aeroplane. With a speed of over 600 miles per hour, the 747, carrying up to 490 passengers, is today's ultimate big people mover. Any radical increase in size is, for the moment, unlikely, and will probably need further breakthroughs in technology, possibly involving planes that leave the atmosphere in flight. It may also require completely new ground handling facilities. If the military need for bigger and bigger bombers was overrun by the increasing sophistication of the defences and the missions, there was one area of military need that continued to require the maximum possible lift. When the Second World War began, there simply were no transport aeroplanes in the modern sense. As a result, during the war, the Germans and the Allies both meddled with the risky and expensive business of employing gliders. The German Messerschmitt Company's Gigant serves as the best example. The thing was designed in expectation of being used in the invasion of England and was rushed through design and into production. It actually represents a pretty good effort at a probably impossible task, and some of its features, like the clamshell doors in the nose, have become commonplace. But it was very big and designed to take off weighing around 40 tons, loaded with tanks. Quite simply, the thing that had been overlooked was the finding of a suitable tug. Leaving the engines off the Gigant made them much simpler to mass produce in a hurry, but they still had to be dragged into the air, and there was no plane available that had the spare power to accomplish that, even with rocket assistance from pods on the Gigant's wings. 3 twin-engined Messerschmitt 110s trained to haul the thing along in an operation that was truly and awesomely dangerous. There were a great number of ways for this process to foul up, and it fouled up repeatedly, sometimes with massive loss of life. Messerschmitt eventually did the logical thing and added 6 engines to their monster. But although as transports these Me-323s did perform effectively, in a war theatre they were too slow to survive and were easy meat for any Allied fighter they happened to blunder into. Unable to run and virtually defenceless, despite the slots for the passengers to fire off their rifles through. At the end of the war, the US transports remained either the relatively small purpose-built Douglas planes or similar-sized variants of bombers. This KB-50 development of the B-29 had added jet engines to help it take off and to up its speed to allow safe in-flight refueling for fighters. Planes of this type were to serve the USAF for many years, but obviously there were limitations on what they could achieve due simply to their size and the absence of specialist design features to make them true cargo aircraft in today's terms. Though adequate for refueling, they were incapable of lugging tanks around. The idea of simply varying the fuselage of bombers to produce passenger and transport planes persisted, however. And the 6-engined B-36, for example, was developed into the XC-99, with a huge cylindrical fuselage capable of carrying 50 tons of cargo or 400 troops. Compared to the World War II transports, which were capable of carrying up to around 10 tons, this was undoubtedly a huge advance. But again, the planes were limited in what could be inserted into the fuselage to make up that tonnage. Though the world's largest land plane at the time, the XC-99 was never proceeded with, only one being built, and though that plane flew safely and relatively economically from 1949 to 1957, the project was abandoned. As the Germans had realized in building their Gigant, to deliver the troops of a division to a war zone was not of much use if they were not accompanied by their equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks and so on. The XC-99 may have made a successful cargo plane, but as a military transport, it suffered from the limitations of all such adaptations of bombers. It hadn't been designed for the role. Perhaps Convair's XC-99 would have been a greater success as a civil passenger plane. But orders from Pan Am were also cancelled, and there was not to be a civil transport as big for many years, till the DC-10 and 747 took to the skies. At the same time as the XC-99 was being developed, the US Navy was working with the Lockheed Company on a transport and cargo carrier, the Constitution. Again, the plane showed more potential as a troop transport and, by implication, a civil airliner. Indeed, Pan Am engineers served as consultants to the Navy on the project. The Constitution, with a span of more than 189 feet and length of 156 feet, was the biggest plane to be made by Lockheed up to its C-5 Galaxy. The pressurized fuselage of the plane was double-decked, with accommodation on both decks and two circular staircases, one fore and one aft. Alternatively, cargo could be stowed on the lower deck, with the capability of handling vehicles only up to the size of a jeep. The Constitution, with seating for around 200 sailors, would have been reconfigured to carry about 110 passengers if a civil variant had been delivered. A point that emphasizes the size of the plane were the service accesses, so that in flight, engineers could go out inside the wing to the engines. In the end, neither the airlines nor the Navy went ahead with purchases. Only 2 of the planes were built, and the Navy flew them from 1946 to 1953, and after that they were sold to a civil operator. When confronted with the cost of having the pair certified for civil use, the owners lost confidence, and the 2 stately planes were scrapped. The Douglas Company, meanwhile, had developed its 1945 designed C-74 Globemaster with a new fuselage as the C-124. It was designed as a cargo plane and directly addressed the critical problems of loading large vehicles. Experience and logic both confirmed that wriggling cargo into a plane through side doors was ineffective. On the earlier C-74, the problem had been addressed with the development of a lift that lowered and raised a section of the floor of the plane. For rapid loading and unloading, and for maximum utilization of the cargo space in a plane, end loading is essential. Loading from the front presents the fewest problems, and this method was adopted on the C-124. The Globemaster represents the first generation of truly practical tactical air transports. They were introduced in 1949 with the ability to lift a 50,000-pound payload and set the pattern for future military transports. Their successors drew on the logic of their design in emphasizing the cargo role rather than the passenger transport role. The cargo planes have proceeded to get more specialist ever since. Of course, for the Globemasters, time ran out, and they were scrapped and turned back into aluminium ingots. Not all planes get this treatment as soon as they're obsolete. Sometimes they get rebuilt, as happened to a number of Stratocruisers and C-97s, which were turned into what's cutely referred to as the pregnant guppies. To transport components for the Saturn rocket program, the planes had a huge lobe joined above the normal fuselage to give them an inside diameter over 20 feet. Later variants were even more distorted to have an inside height of 25 feet. Nowadays, they're even used to cart assembled sections of aircraft fuselages between factories. To load the guppy, there are no doors. The plane is simply split into 2 sections, the cargo inserted and the fuselage then bolted back together around it. Obviously, this is time-consuming and cumbersome and is only applicable to particular situations and particular loads. It wouldn't be practical in a military airlift. But the Guppies are truly notable transport aircraft, not just because they look so weird, but because they are practical giants. In the area of military transport, it was the Lockheed Company that was gradually to claim the production niche for themselves. Starting with the Hercules in 1956, they have built a series of planes, all of which are still in service today, which fill the whole gamut of needs in tactical materials supply. The four-jet C-141 Starlifter was the winner of a 1960 competition for the USAF's first jet-powered long-range freighter. The Lockheed design team had settled on a high wing concept to place the floor of the aircraft at truck bed height. With all the fuel stored in the wings, a new system of articulated tanks was devised to cope with the flexing of the wings. The four big jet engines employed thrust reversal assemblies to allow up to 40% of the engine's power to be used for braking to shorten the length of the landing strip needed for the aircraft. The initial configuration of the Starlifter gave it a span of 160 foot and a length of 145 feet. Carrying 62,000 pounds of payload, it had a range of 4,100 miles. Its interior space of 6,500 cubic feet in a 70-foot-long cargo hold did not allow the plane to actually carry as much as the available power of the engines could cope with. This was to become more significant later in its career. For cargo loading and unloading, a multi-segment hydraulically operated rear door was provided, incorporating a vehicle ramp. The first C-141 took to the air on the 60th anniversary of the Wright brothers' historic flight on the 17th of December 1963. Deliveries to the USAF began in 1964, and in all, 285 of the big transports were ordered and delivered. The type became operational with the Military Airlift Command on the 23rd of April 1965. Within 4 months, the Starlifter was called on to play a major role in the airlift of personnel, equipment and supplies to and from Vietnam. They were to stay in use on that route until the last flights out, loaded with refugees in 1975. The nose doors of the earlier Globemasters and Germany's Gigant did not allow for any airdropping of cargo or troops, and so the incorporation of rear doors has replaced or complements them in all military transports. Tight budgets after 1973 meant that the Material Airlift Command was unable to increase its fleet, and in addition, by then it was obvious that the C-141 needed modifications, particularly to incorporate in-flight refueling. Lockheed and the USAF devised a scheme to fill both requirements at minimum cost. By inserting a 13-foot fuselage plug in front of the wing and another 10-foot insert behind the wing, the usable volume was increased by almost 75% to 11,399 cubic feet. In-flight refueling apparatus was incorporated in the forward plug. After flight trials on the modification in 1977, Lockheed were funded to modify all existing C-141s to the new specification. Now, with a maximum payload of 89,000 pounds and a fuselage of 168 feet, the C-141 is even more impressive. But the original USAF specification had failed to allow sufficient width in the fuselage to enable the cartage of some large pieces of Army equipment, such as heavy tanks and troop-carrying helicopters. Therefore, it couldn't cater for the increasing desire to do away with large, expensive overseas garrisons and replace them with an increased flexibility of home-based troops. Contracts for design studies were awarded, and eventually Lockheed and General Electric were selected to build the airframes and engines of the new transport, which was to be able to carry over twice the load of the Starlifter, the C-5 Galaxy. The C-5 looks pretty much like an enlarged C-141, retaining the high-mounted wing, underslung engines, T-tail and undercarriage pods. General Jack Catton, commander of the Military Airlift Command, flew the C-5 at Edwards Air Force Base just before the official acceptance of the first aeroplane.
Well, since you bought it now, what do you think of the big bird?
Well, I can't say that I'm anything but tremendously impressed. It's a very important thing to the country, and well, it handled so nicely. It's got the range, it's got the speed, and it's got the payload. It can do just what we want it to do.
The huge wings presented special problems, as their weight and length combined to set up severe wing oscillations, and Lockheed had to develop special constant computer monitoring and damping of the wing to keep the flapping to a minimum. Even with the system operating, there's some movement of the wings, but with it off, the plane mimics a bird. Though it can cruise 8,400 miles empty, with its maximum payload of 265,000 pounds, the Galaxy's range is reduced to under 2,000 miles. As a result, in-flight refueling is not only essential, but frequent. The Galaxy making the Boeing 707-based C-135 tanker look like a midget. In common with the Galaxy, the Soviets' AN-124 has straight-through loading and unloading, with ramps in the nose and the tail. The Russian plane, with its maximum takeoff weight of 870,000 pounds, is slightly larger, though some of this weight is absorbed in the less sophisticated construction of the plane itself. Both are modern giants, not the biggest planes in the world, but certainly big enough. Future giants will doubtless evolve. There doesn't seem to be any shortage of carting things about to be done. And in some ways, we're still working with the first generations of these massive transport planes. Undoubtedly, lessons are being learned and answers to problems deduced, ready for testing in the next generation.
The story of the development of vertical and short takeoff. Over the years, designers have expended a lot of ingenuity in trying to do away with the runway, from early rotary wings to the Harrier jump jet. Don't miss this program, simply entitled Verticals.